Korea imposes sanctions on 7 North Koreans and 2 Russian vessels over the regime's weapons trade with Russia that violates UN Security Council resolutions. South Korea will take turns to hold the UNSC presidency next month, with a host of issues on the agenda, such as cybersecurity and North Korea. The nation's University Council confirmed today an increase in the medical school admissions quota for 2025, finalizing the first such expansion in nearly 3 decades. Some 1,500 additional places are expected to be added next year. It's May 24th, 2024. This is Newscenter. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. South Korea has imposed a new round of sanctions against North Korea over the regime's military cooperation with Russia and for raising funds to support Pyongyang's nuclear and missile development. Japan also made a similar announcement on the same day. Our foreign affairs correspondent Bae Eun-ji has our top story.
South Korea has issued new sanctions against North Korea as part of its latest efforts to counter the regime's growing nuclear and missile threats. The sanctions were slapped on 7 North Korean individuals and 2 Russian vessels related to military cooperation between Pyongyang and Moscow. Among them is Lee Myung-hyuk, a North Korean representing a state-controlled company based in Syria, who is suspected of being involved in the legal trade of weapons and arms equipment with Russia. Another, Han Hyuk-chul, the head of a company based in Vladivostok, was also put on the list for being involved in taking diesel into North Korea from Russia. 5 other individuals helped raise funds to support the North's nuclear missile programs by earning foreign currency as IT workers in Russia. The Russian vessels were placed under sanctions for allegedly transporting military supplies by carrying a large number of containers between Russia and North Korea. With the sanctions now in place, those wishing to engage in financial transactions with the individuals must obtain permission from the governor of the Bank of Korea or the Financial Services Commission. And the captain of the Russian ships must have domestic entry approval from the regulatory authority before entering South Korea. Announcing this on Friday, the Foreign Ministry said weapons trade between North Korea and Russia is a clear violation of UN Security Council resolutions, and stressed that South Korea and the international community have repeatedly called for an immediate end to their illegal military cooperation. Separately, Japan also announced sanctions on 11 organizations and 1 individual, including what it said were Russian groups linked to military cooperation to support the war in Ukraine. The country's chief cabinet secretary, Yoshimasa Hayashi, said in a press conference that this freezes the assets owned by the targeted organizations and individuals, and added that the transfer of North Korean weapons to Russia could further aggravate the situation in Ukraine. The sanctions come after Russia recently vetoed the extension of a mandate for the United Nations panel of experts that have been monitoring sanctions on North Korea, prompting South Korea, U.S., and other allies to seek alternatives. Bae Eun-ji, Arirang News.
South Korea is poised to preside over the UN Security Council this June for the first time in a decade. And among many issues on its agenda are cybersecurity and North Korea. Lee Seung-jae tells us more.
For the first time in a decade, South Korea is set to hold the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council next month. South Korea, which is a non-permanent UNSC member, will chair the council for 1 month as the council's 15 member states rotate on a monthly basis. During a press meeting, Seoul's top envoy to the UN, Hwang Jun-guk, said undertaking the presidency is an important role in coordinating the UNSC agenda, adding that South Korea will be ready to convene a UNSC meeting in the event of a provocation by North Korea. Hwang emphasized that the role of the chairing country is important as it affects the direction of discussions on key global issues and international opinion. During its month-long presidency, South Korea will seek to hold high-level public discussions on the topic of cybersecurity. Seoul has been heavily focused on such issues due to evolving threats by Pyongyang in the security domain. For this, Foreign Minister Cho Tae-yeol plans to preside over the session. South Korea's top envoy to the UN stressed that malicious cyber activities on key infrastructure and theft of civilian data and cryptocurrency are threats that all countries face. Hwang added that despite the importance of cybersecurity, the topic has not been dealt with as an official UNSC agenda. Seoul also plans to hold public discussions under the theme Child and Armed Conflicts at the request of the UN Secretariat. The ambassador expressed his hope that South Korea's presidency will contribute to the nation's push to expand its diplomatic horizons and emerge as a global pivotal state. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Two B-1B strategic bombers arrived at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam on Thursday as part of a routine bomber task force deployment. The U.S. Pacific Air Forces Command said the bombers were moved from Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota to strengthen readiness and role-based international order in the Pacific. It spoke about plans to carry out joint exercises with allies and partners in the region. Accordingly, the possibility has been raised of a joint drill with Korea and Japan, as took place last December over waters southeast of Jeju Island. The highly anticipated summit between South Korea, Japan, and China will take place on Monday. Amid tensions arising from regional issues, the three sides are likely to try to push for cooperation rather than discuss sensitive issues. This includes the possible revival of discussions on forming a three-way free trade deal. Our top office correspondent Oh Soo-young talked to some experts.
South Korea, Japan and China will focus on cooperation, not contentious security issues, at their long-stalled trilateral summit on Monday. Experts told Arirang News that the meeting comes as the three Northeast Asian neighbours seek to reduce geopolitical tensions in the Indo-Pacific region, along with trade and economic uncertainties. Seoul's top office said Thursday that President Yoon Suk-yeol, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and Chinese Premier Li Qiang would discuss 6 main areas of cooperation, including people-to-people exchanges and trade, which would be reflected in their joint statement. While the three nations would discuss regional affairs and complex global crises, Seoul made it clear that sensitive security issues would not be the focus of the talks.
The focus would be promotion of a mutual understanding and the pragmatic mutual interest, as opposed to strategic competition and opposition. And this is a very uncertain time for all three countries. The political leadership in Seoul and Tokyo are suffering from early coming of the lame duck syndrome with a very low popularity ratings. And China is very conscious of ongoing strategic competition with the United States, as well as the inauguration of new president in Taiwan. So the mutual interest would be cultivation of pragmatic interest and stability in the region.
While bilateral sticking points and geopolitical tensions will not be resolved easily, experts say they could be managed by focusing on functional issues.
In today's kind of complex world, the very complicated world, interdependence world, we need a sort of a very skillful balance skill to balance different kind of issue, imperative. So we have to deal with this geopolitical challenge, deal with like North Korea issue, Taiwan issue, U.S. pressures. But at the same time, we have to deal with this the issue on the ground, the integration of the economy, and like health issue, climate issue.
Yoon's Deputy National Security Advisor Kim Tae-ho said the three leaders will revive and normalize their trilateral cooperation system. Observers say this could potentially restart discussions to forge a three-way free trade agreement.
So we may see some potential progress towards reopening talks for a trilateral free trade agreement, if only because China has some incentive to go ahead with this, since the problems of the Chinese economy, its slowing growth, its property debt bubble crisis, that gives the Chinese government some incentive to try and possibly get some economic benefits out of a free trade agreement. And also concerns about cost of living and ongoing economic stagnation in both Japan and South Korea also could give some impetus to a free trade agreement negotiations, possibly going ahead. But
the three Northeast Asian countries make up around 23.4% of the world's gross domestic product. Yoon, Kishida and Lee will meet with around 80 business leaders in a welcoming banquet and hold a separate business summit after their trilateral meeting. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
The nation's University Council confirmed today an increase in the medical school admissions quota for next year, finalizing the first such expansion in nearly 3 decades. Choi Min-jung has the latest.
The government's plan to raise the medical school admission quota has become a reality. The Korean Council for University Education met on Friday to deliberate over and confirm changes to the 2025 college admissions plan submitted by each university. The final results of the meeting will be announced on May 30th, and universities will announce updated admissions guidelines by the 31st. The government said this marks the first medical quota increase in almost 3 decades.
The 4 main pillars of medical reform aim to expand the number of medical school admissions for the first time in 27 years, to increase the significantly insufficient number of doctors, and revive the collapsing local medical system.
The government's stance is that there will no longer be room for negotiation for change in the future. The government also renewed their call for doctors to return to work.
Please return to work as soon as possible. That's the starting point for resolving the conflict. Due to the prolonged absence, field staff are becoming exhausted, and the anxiety is growing among patients and their families.
Despite the call, national universities have been rebelling against the government's plan by refusing to reflect the quota hike in their school regulation amendments. There have been strong protests from people within the medical community against expanding medical school admissions since the plan was announced on February 20th. More than 90% of resident doctors have left their workplaces, and medical school professors have also submitted resignations or leave of absence requests. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
The U.S. authorities have approved ETFs in the cryptocurrency Ethereum to be listed on stock exchanges following a similar decision for Bitcoin ETFs made earlier. An Sung-jin takes a look at what this means for the market.
The creation of Ethereum spot ETFs has now become possible. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission on Thursday approved the listing of Ethereum exchange-traded funds, which was filed by several asset management companies, including BlackRock and Van Eck. NASDAQ, the Chicago Board Options Exchange, and the New York Stock Exchange can now list ETFs tied to the price of Ethereum. Though individual ETF issuers will have to get their S1 filings approved before the products can launch, this signals that Ethereum ETFs can be traded on the stock market. The SEC's decision comes less than 6 months after it approved Bitcoin ETFs. Given that the SEC rejected spot Bitcoin ETFs for more than a decade over market manipulation concerns, it comes as a surprise for some in the cryptocurrency industry who had expected the commission to reject the filings. Reuters noted that this move is expected to pave the way for other products to begin trading later this year. Ethereum is one of the world's largest cryptocurrencies. The price of Ethereum hiked after the announcement, surpassing $3,800. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
Shifting gears, the Israeli military is expanding its offensive deeper into Rafah while continuing to shell northern and central Gaza. Amidst ever-increasing tension in the region, the U.S. CIA director is reportedly traveling back to Europe to revive truce talks between Israel and Hamas. Kim Bo-kyung tells us more.
Israel's military is reportedly moving deeper into the southern Gaza Strip, according to the New York Times and other media outlets on Thursday local time. The Israel Defense Forces claimed that it was operating in the Brazil and Shaboura areas of Rafah, as it seems to be expanding its offensive deeper into the city. Israeli tanks are continuing to operate in 3 eastern suburbs, and residents say they are advancing towards the city's densely populated western district of Ibna as well. Since Wednesday night, airstrikes in multiple regions of central and northern Gaza have also been ongoing, including Zabalia and Deir al-Balah. At least 12 people were killed during the bombing of an aid storage warehouse in central Deir al-Balah, from where the victims were taken to the only hospital that is functioning in Gaza.
A while ago, victims of a massacre arrived at the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital, part of the massacres in this genocide by the occupation army. 12 were killed during this massacre. Most of them were women from Deir al-Balah.
The IDF offensive is expanding despite international pressure and isolation over its war against Hamas, with the International Criminal Court prosecutor requesting arrest warrants for Israel's leader and defense minister, and Norway, Ireland, and Spain announcing recognition of a Palestinian state. To revive talks for a truce between Israel and Hamas, CIA Director Bill Burns is reportedly traveling back to Europe, where he is expected to meet the Qatari Prime Minister and the director of Israel's Mossad. This comes after Israel's War Cabinet instructed its negotiating team on Thursday to resume talks on the ceasefire and hostage swap deal. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
In the U.S., hundreds of Harvard University graduating students walked out of their commencement ceremony on Thursday over a decision to bar the graduation of their peers involved in pro-Palestine protests. Earlier this week, Harvard announced that 13 students whose degrees had been withheld would join the official list of eligible graduates. But on Wednesday, one of the school's 2 governing boards overturned this decision. The board said the school students could appeal and that their degrees would be confirmed if they return to good standing. The students, for their part, claimed they are being punished for putting into practice their freedom of speech. There's been a special event here in the country this week. The Overseas Korean Agency has invited overseas adoptees to share their experiences, providing them with an opportunity to establish their identity as Koreans. Our Choi Soo-young files their story with us.
It took 50 years for Julia, born with the name Park Hae-kyung, to return to her birthplace.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I landed in Korea, I felt like I was coming home. It's almost like I felt it in every cell of my body that I had finally returned to where I belong.
She reunited with her birth family in February this year.
Our books begin at chapter 2. The introduction, the table of contents, the first few chapters are ripped out. So learning the story was valuable. Incredibly valuable, but I think more so just seeing their faces and seeing how much I look like them, and to feel a connection that's unlike I've ever felt.
Heidi, adopted by a U.S. family in 1974 when she was 6 months old, said that all her curiosity about Korea, which she had intentionally kept hidden, came flooding out all at once.
It just came at that pivotal moment for me. And as I was becoming a big fan of BTS, and I was starting to try to learn the language, everything kind of coincided. And it was that switch turned in, and I wanted to know all the stuff. It's this discovery of this other piece of who I am, and to be able to embrace that is very meaningful.
From Tuesday to Friday, the 2024 Overseas Korean Adoptees Gathering was held in Seoul by South Korea's Overseas Korean Agency. 96 people from 15 countries were invited to share their experiences as Korean adoptees. The agency stated that the adoptees should be treated as overseas Koreans, not just as adoptees.
Adoptee is unquestionably an overseas Korean and eligible for support from their homeland. The Overseas Koreans Agency aims to strengthen ties with adoptees worldwide in Korea. The agency will continue to promote gatherings like this conference to strengthen networks among overseas Koreans.
Julia Haegyong said that this gathering was very important in finding out her identity as Korean.
I would like to see us moving forward in this gathering to really establish a network globally with other adopted Korean organizations, while also building a relationship with the Overseas Korean Agency and just feeling more connected to this country, our homeland, you know, the place of our origin.
During the conference, adoptees had the opportunity to experience Korean culture with their families, deepening their understanding of the country.
Adoptees visiting Korea experienced the cultural heritage of their birth country at the Korean Folk Village, a living museum featuring Korea's traditional lifestyles and performances.
The agency noted that adoptees' children are the ones who are actually embracing Korean culture more with their parents. Sophia, who loves K-pop and attended the conference with her mother, who was adopted by a Norwegian family, expressed feeling a genuine, familiar connection to Korean culture.
It was almost like there was a part of me that was empty, but I didn't really know until I kind of stepped off the plane. And I felt like this is another part of me that I have to kind of reconnect with. And she was actually the one pushing me a bit. So it's been like a common journey for us to try and connect more with Korean culture and language.
The Overseas Korean Agency will help these adoptees not only in finding their birth family, but also in embracing their identity as Overseas Koreans and passing down this heritage to future generations. Cho Hyung, Arirang News.
K-pop girl group NewJeans has dropped their first new album in 10 months. Their double single, How Sweet, released on Friday at 1 p.m. Korea time, comes amid the internal conflict between their label Adore and its parent company HYBE. Adore says it includes 4 songs on which the members worked very hard together on, including the title track How Sweet, the pre-release track Bubblegum, and instrumental versions of them. On the same day, BTS leader RM released his second solo album, Right Place, Wrong Person. His agency Big Hit Music says that this album, containing 11 tracks, including the title Lost, began with his question of what he might have been doing if he had chosen a different career path. Showers have been falling around the southern inland areas since late this afternoon. There might be some thunder and lightning during showers due to unstable atmosphere. And hail is expected in some high mountainous areas in the southern parts of the country. Tomorrow it will be mostly cloudy in the central parts of the country and sometimes cloudy in the southern parts. The heat will gradually ease off in the southern parts of the country. On Sunday, the whole country will be cloudy and rain will gradually begin to fall in the afternoon and expand across the country at night, and this rain will continue until Monday. Tomorrow's Seoul will start off at 18 degrees Celsius. Daytime temperatures will move up to 25 in Seoul and Jeju, Busan and Gyeongju 23 degrees. After the rain stops on Monday, warm and clear weather will come around again for the time being. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world. That is Newscenter for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session coming up.
Welcome. 엄청난 에너지를 춤으로 뿜어내는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니? 웰컴. (24시간) 불이 꺼지지 않는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니? 하나, 둘, 셋.
Hey, Mr. Cupid, who's lying? Make sure you listen to what I say. I may be stupid or quite naive.
끝없이 쏟아지는 포토스팟. 휴대폰 한 대로 감당할 수 있겠니?
Arrow straight through my heart.
뮤지컬 아빠의 청춘, 배우들의 그 개성 넘치는 연기와 노래, 춤, 그리고 거기에만 화려한 조명, 이런 것들을 충분히 감상하실 수 있는 웰메이드 트롯 뮤지컬입니다.
어떻게 인생이 좋고 달기만 하겠냐? 어?
The president also remains committed to boosting Korea's ties with its global partners on the sidelines of this latest.
To discuss the current security environment.
The United Nations most powerful body on global security
expressing hope. Stock markets around the world have taken a hit. Speculation that the US Federal Reserve Arirang.
A very warm welcome to everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Within the Frame. Coming to you live from Seoul, I'm Han Daeun. It's now official. The Korea-Japan-China Trilateral Summit will be held in Seoul next Monday in what will be the first three-way meeting among the three Asian neighbors in more than 4 years. The annual summit has been stalled in the past few years due to a combination of the COVID-19 restrictions, historical feuds between Korea and Japan, and soured Seoul-Beijing relations amid the Yoon administration's pro-American foreign policy. But putting thorny issues aside, President Yoon Suk-yeol, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, and Chinese Premier Li Qiang are expected to resume talks focusing primarily on deepening economic cooperation and other areas of mutual interest. For a sneak peek into what we can expect from the highly anticipated summit, we have Kim Jae-chun, Dean and Professor at Seogang Graduate School of International Studies, joining us virtually. It's great to have you with us.
It's good to be here.
Also with us this evening is Mason Ritchie, Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Always great to see you.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
All right, let's start off with you, Professor Kim. This will mark the first Korea-Japan-China Trilateral Summit in more than 4 years, as I mentioned at the top. First, tell us about the significance.
The three countries are finally holding this much-awaited summit. So that, in and of itself, is very significant. This trilateral summit has been suspended for about 4.5 years, as you said, mainly because of COVID pandemic, but also there was some unfortunate history issues that got in the way. And more importantly, so-called new Cold War international order. This new Cold War makes the summit between three countries very difficult. Why is that? Because a new Cold War has brought about what I would call blockization of the international order. So on the one hand, we have a group of liberal countries that try to preserve and strengthen the existing rule-based order, rules-based liberal international order. On the other hand, we have a block of revisionist countries, revisionist countries that want to sort of rewrite or revise the existing international order to their liking. And we all know that South Korea and Japan belong to the bloc of liberal countries, whereas China is de facto leader of the bloc of revisionist countries. And recently, South Korea and Japan strengthened the strategic ties with the United States, but China is having a strategic competition with the United States, which makes trilateral cooperation between three countries very difficult. That said, I think three countries also understand that there are issues they can cooperate on, although their strategic stance has become quite divergent. That's why they are holding this summit, and that I think is the most significant aspect of the summit. And to South Korea, Korea-US-Japan relation is very important. But Korea-China bilateral relation is also important as well. So this trilateral summit, I think, is going to be a very important venue for South Korea to enhance cooperation with China.
Well, this can be a turning point for the three neighbors to resume and normalize the trilateral cooperation system, right? And as you pointed out, that itself holds significance. And this could, of course, be added to the long list of President Yoon's major diplomatic achievements. And staying with you, Dr. Kim, economic cooperation among the three countries is expected to take center stage during this round of bilateral and trilateral summits. Do you expect an expansion of free trade agreements as well as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, better known as RCEP?
Well, it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell what sort of outcomes would come out with regard to the free trade principles and also regional trade agreements such as RCEP and also CPTPP, because China is having a trade war with the United States, and basically South Korea and Japan are on the side of the United States. We can't deny that, but we'll have to understand that it's not like South Korea and the U.S. are seeing eye to eye on everything, particularly on issues related to trade. Likewise, Japan and the U.S. aren't really on the same page as far as trade is concerned. True that South Korea and Japan endorsed the U.S. supply chain resilience policy, but the U.S. supply chain resilience policy doesn't necessarily mean complete decoupling with China's economy. It's more of de-risking, so the saying goes. So decoupling is taking place only in strategic industries. In fact, trade volume between the U.S. and China hit record high last year, which means that South Korea and Japan can also maintain proper trade relations with China. Although it's true that the international trade environment has become very unfavorable. So I cautiously anticipate that some positive statements would come out with regard to free trade principles and supply chain cooperation between three countries.
So they have their differences in their approach to advanced technology, especially in the semiconductor sector, but will likely focus on areas where they can draw mutual benefits. According to various reports, a joint declaration is expected to be adopted after the summit, and it'll likely focus on expanding free trade. But the details still remain murky, as you pointed out. Now, Professor Ritchie, nonetheless, the worsening supply chain risks due to intensifying U.S.-China competition remains a big hurdle for the world economy. How would the three countries address this thorny issue?
Well, at least in the context of the summit, we're going to get statements of economic interdependence. We're going to hear about the benefits of trade between and among these three countries. They will reiterate, whatever good economic news there is, and as we just heard, possibly broach the idea of deepening trade relations through, perhaps the development of, greater trade agreements among the three. We'll probably hear something about green economic development and how Japan, South Korea, and China are all important in terms of helping their countries, but also the world, become greener in their economic development. We'll hear about the importance of people-to-people economic exchange. But at the end of the day, trade divergence is nonetheless the undertone. As we just heard, the U.S. is leading on export controls for sensitive, especially militarily sensitive product classes and dual-use items, notably semiconductors. Also, the United States has just put a lot of tariffs, or is in the process of putting a lot of tariffs on products from China. South Korea and Japan, for their part, as we just heard, are more or less on the side of the U.S. In this case. Not exactly supporting everything, obviously, but cautiously on the side of the United States. And of course, South Korea and Japan themselves have a declining trade weight with China. Last month, South Korea, for the first time, had greater total two-way trade with the U.S. than with China, and that's been the case with Japan for a while too. And so we see, South Korea and Japan, decreasing somewhat their trade relationship with China and increasing it with the U.S. South Korea and Japan are, of course, also looking for supply chain diversity, both vis-a-vis China through de-risking, but also more globally. They don't want to become over-reliant on any one country or even two countries. And then for China's part, China has its own Made in China 2025 policy, which it's aiming towards, which is, in practice, a way of gaining greater greater economic autonomy, and this is supported by what it's sometimes called a dual circulation model, where certain strategic items are being increasingly produced within China, and so in this sense, also China is trying to become more economically independent.
It'll be quite interesting to see if the summit will have an impact on the decreasing trade volume exports to China from Korea and Japan. And staying with you, Dr. Ritchie, the U.S. deployed 2 B-1B strategic bombers to a U.S. airbase in Guam on Thursday, saying they've returned to train with allies to enhance readiness and reinforce the rules-based international order in the Pacific, a term that China does not particularly like. Why do you think the U.S. military made the move right before the trilateral summit, and how would China react?
So the U.S. Indo-PACOM is calling this assignment one in support of a routine bomber task force deployment. I'm personally not privy to the decisions of Indo-PACOM about which bombers they're going to deploy for training missions, when and where. It's entirely possible that this, was planned in advance, and this happens to be a coincidence. In fact, at least in terms of the trilateral summit, I think that's the case. But I would say not only does this B-1B bomber deployment come right before the trilateral summit, but it also, as China has decided to hold military drills around Taiwan to quote unquote punish it after the inauguration of its new leader, Lai Ching-te. And so I don't think that that's necessarily coincidental. I think one of the interesting questions, of course, will be to what extent will these bomber missions here and training with allies include South Korea and Japan. And again, I don't have any privy information regarding that, but it's entirely possible, as it has happened in the past. And certainly that's something that China will take note of.
And we'll talk more about Taiwan as we move on. But before that, Professor Kim, the summit comes just weeks after China and Russia jointly urged the U.S. to stop military intimidation against North Korea. Although the North Korea issue has been excluded from the official agenda of the trilateral summit, President Yoon is expected to touch upon North Korea during his one-on-one talks with Lee and Kishida. Would Korea be able to induce China's bigger role in taming North Korea?
I don't think so. I don't think it's likely. I mean, China is not going to agree on putting any kind of pressure on North Korea. As you indicated, China's position is basically, hey, let's not intimidate North Korea anymore. If you intimidate North Korea, we will not tolerate. So it's unlikely for China to agree to say, yeah, we'll play a bigger role on issues related to North Korea. I think China's position toward North Korea now is just to let them be, just to let them be. As I said, it's that blockization thing. In this new Cold War era, in this era of blockization, North Korea's strategic value to China looms larger than ever, because North Korea is a very important member of that bloc of revisionist countries. So say that if North Korea conducts another nuclear weapons test, sure, it can raise some eyebrows in Beijing, because Beijing still wants stability on the Korean Peninsula, I think. But China would never, ever abandon North Korea, because North Korea now is strategically very, very important. So the best that can come out about North Korea issues maybe something like 3 countries agree on nuclear-free Korean Peninsula, or denuclearization will have to come in peaceful manner, in diplomatic manner. Realistically, we can't really expect anything more from China.
The government, when asked about this, acknowledged that North Korea's nuclear issue is a topic that's hard to reach an agreement in a short period of time. So expectations are certainly not high on that front. Professor Ritchie, Taiwan's new president Lai Ching-te was sworn in on Monday, and China has summoned South Korean and Japanese diplomats in apparent protest to the two neighbors attending Lai Ching-te's inauguration ceremony. Would China raise its voice about this during the summit?
So one never knows how dyspeptic China is going to be in these meetings. Sometimes they surprise you, by being more assertive than one might think, given the context. But the concept for the agenda of this, trilateral meeting really seems to be highlighting areas of mutual cooperation and mutual interest, and so that includes people-to-people exchanges, health, some science and technology cooperation, disaster response, economics and trade, as we've already talked about. North Korea, as you just mentioned, is not being prioritized, although there may be something in there about abductees, perhaps making it into the resolution, or at least somehow that might be brought up in one way or another in the meetings. But security in general isn't being prioritized because it's contentious. And, in many respects, the point of this meeting is simply for all three countries' leaders to be able to say that they can stand to be with each other in the same room long enough to talk about some important issues. So the expectations are low. And so if security is not being prioritized and expectations are low, Taiwan is probably not something that's going to be welcome on the agenda. China, I'm sure, will find a way, in one form or another, to get its message on Taiwan across to Yoon and Kishida, who themselves will reiterate their one China policy. So I don't really expect that to be a problem, but you're certainly not going to make any big progress on that issue either.
Now, a Chinese media outlet, Huanqiu Shibao, published an op-ed saying that the summit will be a test for the Yoon administration to correct its China policy. What's your outlook, Professor Ritchie, on post-summit Seoul-Beijing relations, and do you anticipate President Xi Jinping to visit Seoul in the near future?
So that statement's absurd, and they know it's absurd, and we know it's absurd. The summit expectations are low, as I mentioned, and that's because there are real points of disagreement between China and South Korea and Japan, and Taiwan is one of those. China insists on what it calls the one China principle, and so when it says that South Korea needs to correct its approach to Taiwan and China, what it means is ultimately it wants South Korea to adopt what it calls the one China principle, which acknowledges China's sovereignty over Taiwan. South Korea and Japan hold, what the United States and Europe and many other countries refer to as a one China policy that forgoes a position on the question of sovereignty of Taiwan, and it says that this is something that's to be worked out between the Taiwanese and the Chinese. So I don't expect a change from South Korea in this regard. As for Xi Jinping, we had the foreign ministers, trilateral foreign ministers meeting last month. And that was sort of the first stepping stone, I guess, of trying to mend trilateral relations, or at least advance them in some way. And now we're getting to step two, and that's the summit among the leaders. And if the summit goes well, you could imagine that that is a condition, perhaps a necessary condition, for Xi Jinping at some point to come to South Korea. But it's not a sufficient condition. There is a lot to overcome in the South Korea-China relationship in order for Xi Jinping to come here, not least of which is the THAAD issue, which still remains. And so, I have a difficult time imagining that Xi Jinping would come to South Korea, even if this meeting goes well, unless things warm up considerably between South Korea and China. and they managed to make some progress on some thorny issues, which, frankly speaking, Yoon doesn't seem inclined to do, whether that be over Taiwan or whether that be over military cooperation with the U.S. in the context of the alliance, or whether that be on the THAAD issue, or whether that be on economic security issues. So I frankly don't see that happening in the near future. I could be wrong. That seems like at best something for the mid to long term.
So President Xi's visit to Seoul is unlikely, at least for the time being. Now, Professor Kim, establishing a framework to hold the trilateral summit on a regular basis is another focal point. While experts agree that China is seeking to break its isolation on the global stage through the three-way cooperation, what are your prospects on this?
Well, establishing a framework to hold the summit on a regular basis, I mean, it shouldn't be too difficult, I think, because we already have this framework to hold the trilateral summit on a regular basis, on yearly basis, because the trilateral summit was held annually from 2008 until 2012, if my memory serves me correct. And for the reference, 2008 was the year when the summit was inaugurated. So from the inception, we held the summit for 5 years in a row. And then some difficult issues got in the way, history issues got in the way, and the summit took place irregularly. But it's important to remember that we have a precedent of holding the summit 5 years in a row. So I don't think it's going to be too difficult to say that, at least in principle, at least in theory, three countries would hold the trilateral summit on regular basis from now on annual basis. But we'll have to wait and see, I guess.
And just very quickly before we let you go, Dr. Kim, the Naver-Yahoo line feud has emerged as a fresh source of diplomatic conflict between Korea and Japan. Would this issue be discussed, and would South Korea make a stronger voice as demanded by the Korean people?
I don't know for sure, but it seems to me that South Korean government is now under increasing pressure because of the growing public anger due to this, Yahoo line scandal. I don't know whether scandal is the right word there, but after the lopsided victory of the opposition parties in general election in last month, it seems to me that Yoon government's foreign policy initiatives would encounter domestic political backlashes. That, I think, includes Korea-Japan relations. True, Korea-Japan relations gained the momentum to restore normal relations, but still there are many more hurdles that both countries need to cross. Challenges would come mostly from within in both countries. I'm not sure whether Korea-Japan relations would endure domestic political changes. With regard to Yahoo line issue, I guess the real issue here is whether Japanese government intervened improperly, in which case South Korean government has no option but to address grievances. So during the trilateral summit, I think President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida would meet bilaterally. I hope that both leaders could somehow iron out the differences on this thorny issue.
Well, this issue will certainly keep popping up as we move forward, and we'll be sure to keep close tabs on it. Thank you, both of you, for your expertise and analysis. And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back with more same time next week. Have a great weekend.